The title of this talk is a scattering of things. The title that I listed on the web is Butterflies, Ants, and World Peace. So I'm going to go through each of them in turn, starting with world peace. How are we doing on the world peace thing? Not so good, actually, you know. I just glanced quickly at the newspaper one day this past week, and some of the headlines: the future of Tea Party, GOP infighting. Battle is looming in states over fossil fuels. Kuwait leads in funding terrorists in Syria conflict. Suicide bombers kill at least 31 at Baghdad rally. Foreigners, and oh goodness, it goes on and on, doesn't it? This sense of world peace and the troubles in the world, and how are we to be with all of this? It just feels so overwhelming, so much of the time, that, any sense of agency or what we can do about it, it just feels, let's just kind of take a nap or eat bonbons or something and just not have to deal with it. And at the same time, the Buddha's teaching, hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is hatred healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. So the Buddha's teachings invite us to cultivate this heart of goodwill and loving kindness, not fixing or changing the world, but being with it with a heart of loving kindness. And in a way that almost feels like worse. It's like not only now do we have all of this going on in the world, but now the invitation is to cultivate loving kindness toward it all, and that can feel really incredibly overwhelming. By love alone is hatred healed, and how are we to do that? The Buddha is talking about a particular kind of love. Someone sent me a list of love words, and noting that there are different kinds of love. There's the Greeks had different words for love: eros, sexual passion, sexual love, or philia, which is deep friendship or loyalty to friends, sharing emotions, sharing things, the kind of constructed love or constructed intimacy that we were talking about last week. Pragma is like long-standing love between old friends or long-married couples, that kind of settling in. And none of those really work when we think about the kind of love that the Buddha is speaking about. And what he's talking about is selfless love or unconditional love, metta, unconditional love for all beings everywhere. Hatred never ceases by hatred. This is what he says about the path of peace. He says, this is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. And there's a really long sutta. I won't read you the whole thing, but just a couple of phrases from it. Wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Let none despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. And again, how do we do this when we deal with these kinds of headlines or these kinds of things going on in the world? How do we navigate it? It just seems it's too daunting, it's too hard, it's too much, it's too strenuous, it's too pretty much everything. We can think, when it comes right down to it, the nuts and bolts of everyday life, it's like, well, the Buddha doesn't know, or the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa, they don't know my mother, or they don't know my boss, or they don't know my brother, or they don't know my neighbor. This neighbor who cuts his trees down. I have this cartoon here where there's a New York. It's one of the New Yorker cartoons, and appears to be a husband and a wife in the middle of an argument. They have like big frowny faces on. And the husband is standing over here in the corner and in the middle of the argument, and he says, yeah, well, the Dalai Lama never had to put up with your whining. And it's sort of like that, when it comes down to it in our lives, it's just like that, world peace or Kuwait or Afghanistan or terrorists or our neighbors or our parents or our children or neighbors or whoever. It's just that, what is this hatred never ceases by hatred? It's too much. It's too much. So the Buddha says, one should cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, freed from hatred and ill will. So the Buddha invites us to explore his teachings actually in 3 layers. Some night I'll give a talk about the 3 layers, but just briefly. The first layer he talks about is the layer of just hearing the teachings. It's what you do when you come here on Tuesday nights, where you listen to them and you go, oh yeah, right, metta or loving kindness, and it sort of sounds right. It's what keeps you coming back, or it keeps you reading books, or keeps you listening to talks. I was thinking, well, it sort of sounds right. And the second layer is the layer of reflection, where the Buddha invites us not to take his word for it, or not to even take the fact that it sounds right as some kind of evidence, but to begin to reflect, how does this work in my life? Really. So this hatred never ceases by hatred, or so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world. That second layer is really, the Buddha says, reflect on this. How does this really work? And for that matter, does it really work in your life? And that the teachings really aren't of much value unless they begin to sift down into that layer of really deeper reflection and more personal reflection. And then the third layer is the layer that we encounter when we meditate, and really understanding and seeing clearly how things work, and the freedom that can come from that kind of wisdom and that kind of concentration, that kind of mindfulness. So that, the Buddha's teaching is, that all layers are important. It isn't like we can skip that first layer of hearing and listening and understanding with our conceptual minds. He's not saying, skip that, it's not important. But to let the kind of teachings really kind of sift down is really what the path of awakening or the path of peace is really about. So when we talk about this path of peace or world peace, it really invites us to reflect more deeply on, well, how do we do this? How do we deal with, this person's whining, or this neighbor, or, this parent, or this sibling, or, boss, or whatever? How do we deal with this? So I'd like to talk about the truth of the Dharma, or how things work, in kind of, that kind of reflection way. And what I would invite you to do as the talk progresses is to maybe pick one thought. It might be a thought that just seems sort of wrong even, or impossible. Or it might be something that strikes you. And to let it be something you carry with you in that reflective way, that second way, of really investigating. Does this really work? Is this true, how this really works? And that's where the butterflies and the ants parts comes in. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. I wanted to assist the talk a little bit by modern science, and that's where the butterflies actually comes in. And I wanted to talk about the butterfly effect. I can't remember if I've talked about that. I know I've talked about it before. I can't remember if I did here or not, but anyway, so if I did, forgive me, we'll do it again. Many of you know of the butterfly effect, which is the theory that everything in the universe just physically affects everything else. Even the tiniest kind of movement affects everything else. You know, that you've heard the flapping of a butterfly's wings in the Amazon affect the weather. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about that theory. There's a scientist in, I forget what year, 1961, Edward Lorenz. He was a meteorologist, and he was working on the computer programs that predict weather systems. And he was in a hurry, and he entered one of the variables. The actual value of the variable was 0.506, I think it's, 0.506127. So it's a 6 decimal variable, 0.506127. And he was in a hurry, and he entered the variable into the computer as 0.506. So it was 0.000127 of a value that was off, that was different. And as he plugged that into the computer, what came out of the computer was a completely different weather scenario. You know, just a completely different scenario. And so he was just really struck by that and started to explore it, and he published it. And sure enough, it has been replicated and fairly well accepted by meteorologists that indeed that is the case. Let me read to you a little bit about it. The phrase refers to the idea that a butterfly's wings might create tiny changes in the atmosphere that may ultimately alter the path of a tornado, or delay, accelerate, or even prevent the occurrence of a tornado in another location. Note that the butterfly does not power or directly create the tornado. The flap of the wings is a part of the initial conditions. One set of conditions leads to a tornado, while the other set of conditions doesn't. The flapping wing represents a small change in the initial condition of the system, which causes a chain of events leading to large-scale alterations of events. Had the butterfly not flapped its wings, the trajectory of the system might have been vastly different. It's possible that the set of conditions without the butterfly flapping its wings is the set that leads to a tornado. So this sense that, you know, that in science, in weather systems, this tiny, tiny little shift in the initial conditions is just one of the variables that actually can lead to this whole cascade of events that can radically alter the formation of a weather system. I just find that information, I just find that really quite delightful. When we come back to thinking about world peace, to think that the flap of a butterfly wing, or for that matter, the flap of a voice or a lip, in terms of language, or look, or behavior, can alter whether or not there's a tornado of sorts. So that the tiniest little movement of, in this case, what we're speaking of, loving kindness, or love, or unconditional love, matters. That we don't have to think about, we don't have to expect ourselves to be Nelson Mandela or Mother Teresa or Desmond Tutu to really begin to examine and appreciate that these little tiny moments really matter. This is Jack Kornfield. He says the best meditation practice uses awareness to heal the heart and is concerned not so much with our stories as with fear and attachment and their release, and with bringing mindfulness to areas of delusion, grasping, and unnecessary suffering. That's sort of what we talk about all the time, isn't it? The spiritual journey, he says, takes us deep into the forest and leads us back to the marketplace again and again, until we are able to find compassion and the sure heart's release in every round, and I would propose in every tiny round. So we practice over and over again with these smallest of moments, cultivating a mind and a heart freed from hatred and ill will. Along with that, in a kind of almost paradoxical sense, the Buddha invites us as a way of doing that, in offering this loving kindness, to cultivate the capacity to see things from a larger view, so that we're not just narrowed down into some kind of fixed view or fixed idea about how things need to be, but can we actually look at things from a larger view. One of the teachings that the Buddha offers to his son, Rahula, and at one point he says, Rahula, develop a awareness that is like a fire. You know, a fire doesn't really care, doesn't react if there's something kind of messy and dirty and ugly thrown into it, or if there's something, you know, really beautiful scroll or a really beautiful flower. That the fire, you know, is fire, no matter what's thrown into it. And develop mindfulness, develop awareness like that. So one of the ways that the Buddha invites us to practice with loving kindness is to develop a mind and a heart that's very spacious and that doesn't really kind of narrow down into that one little, you know, that thing about the whining, that doesn't narrow down to the one little focus, but really cultivates a way of looking at something such that we can bring loving kindness even to that. Amid all the vicissitudes of life, gain and loss, repute and ill repute, praise and censure, pain and happiness, the Buddha never wavered. He was firm as a solid rock. Touched by happiness or by pain, he showed neither elation nor depression. He never encouraged wrangling and animosity. Addressing the monks, he once said, "I do not quarrel with the world, monks. It is the world that quarrels with me." An exponent of the Dhamma does not quarrel with anyone in the world. He admonished his disciples in these words, "If others were to speak ill of me, or ill of the Dhamma, or ill of the Sangha, you should not on that account entertain thoughts of enmity and spite and be worried. If, monks, you are angry and displeased with them, it will not only impede your mental development, but you will also fail to judge how far that speech is right or wrong, how far the other person's speech is right or wrong. You should unravel what is untrue and make it all clear." And then he goes on to say the same thing if others speak highly of me. He says, deal with it in much the same way. So how about us in our ordinary lives? I wanted to spend much of the rest of the time with some poetry, and part of the reason for the poetry was that I was inspired by some of the poems I was reading to do that. But a large part too, you know, when we think about the reflection piece, that second layer, the reflection piece invites us to use something beyond our conceptual minds, beyond our logical minds. Modern neuroscience is saying that one of the aspects of a balanced and coherent mind is the capacity to relate to experience both from the left side, the conceptual, logical, linear mind, and from the right side, which is more symbolic, more intuitive, more dreamlike at times. So I thought to bring some poetry in to reflect some of these points as a way of inviting us to kind of reflect a little bit more deeply and to maybe play a little bit more deeply with some of these notions. So here's a poem. The title of this is Phone Call. Maybe I overdid it when I called my father an enemy of humanity. That might have been a little strongly put, a slight exaggeration. An immoderate description of the person who at that moment, 2,000 miles away, holding the telephone receiver 6 inches from his ear, must have regretted paying for my therapy. What I meant was that my father was an enemy of my humanity. And what I meant behind that was that my father was split into 2 people, one of them living deep inside of me like a bad king or an incurable disease, blighting my crops, striking down my herds, poisoning my wells. The other, standing in another time zone in a kitchen in Wyoming, with bad knees and white hair sprouting from his ears. I don't want to scream forever. I don't want to live without proportion, like some kind of infection from the past. So I have to remember the second father, the one whose TV dinner is getting cold while he holds the phone in his left hand and stares blankly out the window, where just now the sun is going down and the last fingertips of sunlight are withdrawing from the hills they once touched like a child. So Tony Hoagland in this poem, he speaks of what the Buddha speaks of, cultivating a mind and heart of goodwill larger than anything that the world throws at us. And indeed, one of the teachings of the Buddha is to kind of look at adjacency, that no matter what the difficulty is, whether it's Assad in Syria or your mother-in-law or your boss, that any way of framing, of formulating an identification as just one thing is incorrect. And so to look at adjacency as a way of practicing loving kindness, to look and see, well, what else is true? And to really bring some attention there. Not in some kind of Pollyanna way, like this negative thing isn't the case, but, as Tony says, I don't want to scream forever. And so to bring awareness to these small movements, just these little small movements, where he just moves to say, well, I can have some compassion for this old man with hair in his ears, to really kind of bring it down to a layer that I can navigate this one. Hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone is hatred healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. Which brings me to ants. So the butterflies is really kind of thinking about small moves. And ants is allowing ourselves to be inspired by small inspirations. I'll tell you a personal one and then I'll read you some more poetry. Many of you know that I spend a fair amount of time in the winter in Bali, one of the great sufferings of my life. And when I come home, people say, well, what was the best thing? You were there for quite a while, you were there for a number of weeks. And inevitably, I'll say, well, one of the best things was feeding the ants. We are blessed in Bali to have our breakfast delivered to our balcony each day. And at the end of breakfast, we spend about 45 minutes distributing the little crumbs from our toast and the little pieces of egg left over to the ants who gather on the floor. And to watch the ants and really be inspired by the amazing ants, the teamwork and the heroism. It's like, look at that. That ant is moving something that's like 12 times its size. But the point there is to be inspired by small things. So not only to do small things, but to be inspired by small things and to look for them. We look and we see such, big calamities in the world. Can we also be inspired by small things? Here's another poem. In praise of craziness of a certain kind. This is a poem by Mary Oliver. She says, on cold evenings, my grandmother, with ownership of half her mind, the other half having flown back to Bohemia, spread newspapers over the porch floor. So, she said, the garden ants could crawl beneath as under a blanket and keep warm. And what shall I wish for myself, but being so struck by the lightning of years, to be like her, with what is left, that loving. Here's another poem. I could not predict the fullness of the day, how it was enough to stand alone without help in the green yard at dawn. How 2 geese would spin out of the ochre sun, opening my spine, curling my head up to the sky in an arc I took for granted, and the lilac bush by the red brick wall flooding the air with its purple weight of beauty, how it made my body swoon, brought my arms to reach for it without even thinking. In class today, a Dutch woman, split in two by a stroke, one branch of her body a petrified silence, walked leaning on her husband to the treatment table while we, the unimpaired, looked on with envy. How he dignified her wobble, beheld her deformation, untied her shoe, removed the brace that stakes her weaknesses. How he cradled her down in his arms to the table, smoothing her hair as if they were alone in their bed. I tell you, his smile would have made you weep. At twilight, I visit my garden where the peonies are about to burst. Some days there will be more flowers than the vase can hold. And can we allow ourselves to receive the sometimes ant-like love of another? Here's another poem. Title is At the Corner Store. I'm going to pause for a minute and just let you breathe for a moment. A lot of poems. You just let yourself breathe and, reflect and just see what's arising for you. And if there's any goodness, if there's any difficulty that's there, but if there's any goodness next to it, choose that. Let yourself feel that in your body. At the corner store. He was a new old man behind the counter, skinny and eager. He greeted me like a long-lost daughter, as if we both came from the same world, some place warmer and more gracious than this cold city. I was thirsty and alone, sick at heart, grief-soiled, and his face lit up as if I were his prodigal daughter, returning, coming back to the freezer bins in front of the register, which were still and always filled with the same old cable car ice cream sandwiches and cheap frozen greens. Back to the knobs of beef and packages of hot dogs, these familiar shelves strung with potato chips and corn chips, stacked up beer boxes and immortal Jim Beam. I lumbered to the case and bought my precious bottled water, and he returned my change, beaming, as if I were the bright new buds on the just bursting open cherry trees, as if I were everything beautiful struggling to grow. And he was blessing me as he handed me my dime over the counter and the plastic tub of red licorice whips. This old man who didn't speak English beamed out love to me in the iron week after my mother's death, so that when I emerged from his store, my whole cockeyed life, what a beautiful failure, glowed gold like a sunset after rain. Frustrated city dogs were yelping in their yards, mad with passion behind their chain-link fences. And in the driveway of a peeling paint house, a woman and a girl danced to contagious reggae. Praise Allah, Jah, the Buddha, Kuan Yin, Jesus, Mary, and even jealous old Jehovah, for eyes, hands of the divine everywhere. So that when I emerged from his store, my whole cockeyed life. Anybody here doesn't have a cockeyed life? You know? Who among us really doesn't have a whole cockeyed life? And can we allow ourselves to really be in these small moments, receiving, giving, offering, noticing? May all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. So the ability to offer this to others goes hand in hand, is actually entwined with our learning to offer it to ourselves. Back and forth, as Jack Kornfield pointed out, back into the, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You know, as we work with our own struggles, we work with our own cockeyed life, our clinging to views, to ideas about how it should be, how you should be, how I should be, how the world should be, what peace looks like out there, what those people should be doing. You know, our whole cockeyed world. You know, can we offer this kind of small moments of kindness to ourselves, to one another? Do you think peace requires an end to war? Or tigers eating only vegetables? Does peace require an absence from your boss, your spouse, yourself? Do you think peace will come some other place than here? Some other time than now, in some other heart than yours? Peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. This moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Peace is this moment without thinking that it should be some other way, that you should feel some other thing, that your life should unfold according to your plans. Peace is this moment without judgment, this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. This is Jack Kornfield, the same quote I read earlier. The best meditation practice uses awareness to heal the heart. It is concerned not so much with our stories as with fear and attachment and their release, and with bringing mindfulness to areas of delusion, grasping, and unnecessary suffering. Bringing mindfulness and release to areas of delusion, grasping, and unnecessary suffering. The spiritual journey takes us deep into the forest and leads us back to the marketplace again and again until we are able to find compassion and the sure heart's release in every realm. A poem by Alice Walker. Love is not concerned with whom you pray or where you slept the night you ran away from home. Love is concerned that the beating of your heart should harm no one. I'll skip 3 poems and read the last one. This is Prayers for the Earth. Now we will count to 12 and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victory with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt the sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go. Butterflies, ants, and world peace. So blessings.